Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Garcia swallowed a startled breath. He hadn't heard any approaching footsteps on the cool stone of the church floor. He didn't notice any movement on the other side of the black lattice, which provided the confessor with his much-needed anonymity. Then the parish priest's heart began to beat a little faster. He quickly realized that the confessor had uttered that weighty sentence in English. Father Garcia is a Hispanic priest for a Hispanic congregation in the uppermost corner of Manhattan, the corner forgotten by the young and the wealthy, the one where tenements are still a reality. Why had he come here then, to Father Garcia, to confess? Hundreds of Roman Catholic churches dot the dense borough. Father Garcia was beginning to sweat, to wish he could see the face of the parishioner, so he could think of him more as a person than a ghost. But that is just part of the job, and the priest realized that right now his responsibility was to be a listening ear to a contrite and repentant man. At least he hoped the man was contrite and repentant. Father Garcia pushed away that thought quickly, not because it wasn't rational or sensible, but because with it he would surely pass out. The 35-year-old, dynamic, slightly accented dark brown shepherd of Washington Heights waited for the man to begin confessing his sins. He felt as if he was underwater, barely able to hold his breath, about to drown. It must have been 5 minutes since the nondescript, seemingly disembodied voice had said the opening line of his confession without continuing into the particulars of his sins. But it had only been 30 seconds when the father looked at his black, plastic-banded Casio electronic watch. It couldn't have been more than half a minute. Father Garcia mustered the courage to urge the confessor on, as he sometimes has to do with the shamed and embarrassed of his flock, as kindly as he possibly could. But as he was about to speak, he choked on the words coming out of his mouth. He realized he didn't even hear breathing from the other side of the confessional. Beaded sweat, fire and ice rolling down his forehead simultaneously, the priest realized he had been looking down at the thick, luscious red velvet carpet of the confessional which lay over the dead stone of the rest of the church, ever since he heard the man on the other side speak. With great apprehension, Father Garcia solemnly raised his head to look out of the lattice wall and see if the figure of a person hovered there. But it was all empty air. Making the sign of the cross on his chest, the Holy Father stepped out of the confessional, as if there was something to investigate, as if the strange confessor had left a clue, something at all, that he truly existed, was a man, and had been standing on the other side of the confessional just moments ago. As he stepped out, he saw nothing. His thoughts raced between terrible awe at whatever must have just occurred and self-derision at what must have been a voice in the wind, or more precisely, in his mind. And then he looked directly underneath him, at the lifeless yet ominous gray of the floor, and he saw an envelope. Dense black ink danced in beautiful, flowing calligraphy on the front of the envelope. On it were written 5 words, "To Father Garcia, my sins." After reading that sinister, boding sentence, Father Garcia lifted his head up again and anxiously threw his gaze around the sanctuary, trying to catch a trace of whoever might have left the postcard-sized envelope addressed to him. But of course there was nothing and no one. Whoever it was gone in the orange-purple sunset over the Hudson River, a sunset which brought with it a fear, a dread, which it laid on top of a single man, Father Garcia. Father Garcia bent down a second time, slow and shaking with trepidation, to pick up the letter. He didn't want to open it here, where anyone could walk it. No, he was much too nervous to greet anyone right now, friend or otherwise. Instead, he walked with anxiety-ridden purpose towards the rectory. In 12 or so heavy steps, he crossed the threshold into his personal office and residence, a place where he could lock the door and fear nothing as he would open the letter. At least that's what he told himself, but in reality the dread brewed and bubbled within him like the deathly cauldron of a few ancient witches. He looked at his office with the dark wooden brown of a mahogany desk and the stately leather chair which went along with it. A chair much too gaudy for a humble, 30-something priest in Washington Heights like Father Garcia. He walked with short, painful steps toward it, about to place the letter down on the waves of wood, when he realized that he needed a more relaxed setting to lighten the mood a bit, so maybe he wouldn't have a heart attack while opening the letter. He turned toward another door, which led to the living area, modest but nicer than what most had all the up in these parts of the borough. He slunk down into a maroon sofa, the kind that just isn't as comfortable as it looks, but is comfortable enough. Looking down again towards the letter, he pictured himself as a child, growing up not too many blocks away from the church, staring down at a Band-Aid, telling himself that he has to just pull it off already, to be man and do it quickly, and then it will be all better. If only it would be all better. After lifting and holding the letter, attempting to sense its contents without having to open the dreaded thing, he realized it was a piece of paper concealed inside the envelope. It felt more plastic. A postcard maybe, the size of the envelope then made a lot more sense. But Father Garcia knew these thoughts were just distractions, anything to push off actually having to unseal the envelope and pull out its contents. He wasn't quite sure why he was so nervous, so tense, so anxious about it. Of course, there was the circumstance of receiving it, and on top of that, the letter's direct address to him. But maybe, probably, he thought, it was just a prank he would be laughing about in a minute or two. But he knew it wasn't. He took his sweaty, cold forefinger and willed it, with all the will he could muster, into the top right corner of the envelope, where the seal had given a little. And in an instant, just like ripping off a Band-Aid, with a bracing expression as if he were about to crash into an oncoming vehicle and had no time to correct, he ran his finger across, ripping the seal and some of the envelope with it. But the task was not yet completed. Really, it hadn't even started. He still had to pull out the contents. Even before removing it, the shiny reflective surface of a Polaroid made it obvious what the father was trepidatiously looking at. He, without realizing that his posture had shot straight up like a bullet in worried anticipation, removed the vintage-style picture from the envelope. 3. The father's spine froze over, his skin suddenly cool and bumpy to the touch. It was a picture of a piano-black wooden figure of the number 3. The numeral meant nothing in particular to the priest whose stiff white collar for the first time felt suffocating. What bothered him, what actually, truly terrified him, was that it appeared in a picture. Why? He thought. Would a written 3, perhaps in the same ominously beautiful calligraphy which adorned the front of the envelope, not have purveyed the same message, whatever that happened to be? A lonely night in the rectory was usually a comfort for Father Garcia, after a long day of shepherding his flock through the uncertainty which modernity brought to traditional faith. Normally beginning to wind down around 9, he would exchange his priestly robes for a plush navy bathrobe, brew himself some hot milk with chocolate syrup, and retire to bed with the latest piece of classical literature which beckoned him from the bookshelf. No other priest called the compact apartment above the rectory home, a fact that usually made him feel all the more comfortable and cozy. But tonight, he wanted anything but loneliness. Coziness turned to dread, and comfort to stifling, dense air. He triple-checked the locks to the rectory and the residence more times than he cared to count, but finally he reached into the cabinet underneath the kitchenette's sink, pulling out a small bottle of 3 or 4 shots worth of whiskey that was wasting away there for the past year or so. Under the circumstances, he thought, a drink or two is warranted. The good father wasn't convinced sleep would come that night, but when he woke up in a pool of sweat and urine, he regretted that it had. Over 2 years of work down the drain, he angrily mused as he slowly detached himself from the wet, sticky, yellow-stained sheets. Dr. Roman declared him healthy enough to give up psychiatric care 6 months ago, and the proud priest wanted anything but to go back. Nightmares and their accompanying bedwetting were things of the past. But now he, lying in his own pee like a helpless infant, began to bawl. After a while, which felt much too long, Father Garcia dragged himself into the shower, threw his bedding in the laundry, and stood in depressed contemplation as the near-scalding water turned his skin bright red and the steam obscured the world around him. "I won't let this get to me. I can't let it," he eventually declared inside his head. "It's just a stupid letter with a stupid picture of a stupid number." With that rush of enthusiastic decision, He vigorously pushed the shower knob into the off position, threw his towel with gusto all around his naked body, and decorated himself with his usual ecclesiastic attire. After all, there was work to do, at 6 o'clock until 8, confessions to hear. That burst of excited inspiration, along with a large caramel cold brew from the Starbucks in the whiter neighborhood a few blocks west, got him through the rest of the day with surprisingly few intrusive thoughts about envelopes and calligraphy and Polaroids. He said Mass twice that morning for an ever-shrinking number of white-haired, leather-skinned congregants spread out thinly over the hard wooden benches of the sanctuary. The first Mass he uttered in a confident, deep-voiced Latin, infecting the air with that ancient, numinous quality, interred in languages long lost. The second in slightly higher, more welcoming Dominican Spanish that made the attendees feel welcomed, embraced deeply by the hug of a church wanting only to save them. Retiring to the rectory for most of the afternoon, Father Garcia completed some administrative work, the mortal enemy of a parish priest who saw himself as a trustworthy shepherd rather than a bureaucrat for the Roman machine. A short nap on the sofa infused in him enough energy to spend the next few hours examining manuscripts and translating Syriac to English for a first edition of an obscure ancient church father that the Vatican wanted published before next Easter. Beep, 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 beep. A daily reminder, 4 shrill warning signs to wake him up from involved and exciting intellectual work and begin heading over to the confessional box. For a few seconds he moved to close his books and stand up, but before his knees and back were fully erect, a frigid sting bit through his entire body. He deflated back into the deep leather cushion of his stately armchair. He did not want to go back out there, but he felt a duty to his congregants and, more importantly, a pride which would not let him give up because of a dumb letter with a dumb picture. He wouldn't let it scare him, but of course, it already had. He stood up again, this time rising slowly like mist from a vast foggy landscape. He took sedated motions as he closed each of his volumes. Painstaking steps led him out of his office, as if chains were wrapped like ivy around his legs. He crossed the threshold into the sanctuary, eyeing the confessional as if it were a prison, perhaps one from which he would never escape. He walked in. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there when a voice, a rough voice made up of broken glass, woke him from his terror-induced daze. It was the voice he was dreading, but the one he knew with certainty would greet him as the luminous sun pushed down onto the endless river just beyond the hill. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Garcia could not breathe. He did not look up. He did not hear any sounds indicative of a human presence beyond his little cubicle, besides for the haunting voice. For many minutes he sat there, a statue of grief and horror etched in marble forever. When he was sure that whoever had uttered that sentence, a sentence which just over 24 hours ago was a welcome plea for forgiveness from God but was now a harbinger of despair, was gone, he walked out of the confessional into the main sanctuary where he expected a postcard-sized letter addressed to him in the finest calligraphy. As he stepped beyond the confessional, the last rays of a dying sun illuminated the magnificent stained glass, casting a bloody orange over the inner sanctum of the church. To Father Garcia, my sins. He stared at it with a hate, a loathing bred of fear and mixed with trembling. He picked it up and walked with a shaking purpose toward the rectory. The same paper-plastic feel informed him that there was another Polaroid in the envelope, and he was fairly certain he knew what would feature in the photograph. 2. It's a countdown. The sickly realization flashed before his eyes and rang deafeningly in his ears. A countdown to what? But he knew that, whatever the answer was, he didn't want to know. One thing was certain. Father Garcia, the proud parish priest of St. Nicholas, would not be sleeping alone tonight. He fumbled together an overnight bag as quickly as he could, and while almost running out of the church's imposing metal-inlaid wooden double doors, he dialed a friend at a larger church in a slightly less forgotten corner of Manhattan. He needed a room for night, at least a night, and he knew they always had extra rooms and, more importantly, multiple occupants at a time. Father Garcia would not be alone tonight, and he would certainly not be alone tomorrow at 6, and he would, he hoped, be out of reach of the gravelly voice that left him strange messages. As Father Garcia exited the pencil-yellow New York City cab in front of St. Agnes, his old friend from seminary, now Father Harris, walked onto the short concrete staircase in front of the historical church to greet him. A heavy, almost intolerable weight forcing down on all aspects of Father Garcia immediately, and obviously struck his longtime acquaintance. His usually smiling lips were almost in a scowl, his forehead was painted with long horizontal lines, his clerical vestments, usually freshly pressed, were wrinkled and dirtied, and a 5 o'clock shadow loomed over his normally shining countenance. Nevertheless, Father Harris flashed his teeth in a large, excited grin and moved quickly forward in preparation for an embrace. "Robbie, so good to see you. It's been much too long," he exclaimed, wrapping his arms tightly around Father Garcia's back. Roberto, though, was silent, returning half a weak clutch in exchange for the hearty bear hug he had received. "Let's get you all set up. There's a large bedroom at the end of the hall that'll be free for at least the next 3 or 4 nights. I'll help you get settled there, and then, if you're comfortable, you can tell me what's bothering you." Roberto Garcia cringed inside. Those last few words, "what's bothering you," felt like a gut punch to his ego. Is that all this really was? Something bothering him? It definitely did not feel that way to him, but maybe that itself was the sign that he was going off the rails, that he needed to see Dr. Roman again. Maybe he even needed to book a stay in a psychiatric hospital. "Okay, Luke, maybe," he murmured in forced response to his gracious host. Father Harris got the message, helped his distraught friend to the bedroom at the end of the long rectory corridor, turned around, offered Roberto anything he might possibly need, and without hearing a response, left the overwrought priest to his own thoughts. Stripping off his disheveled robes, Father Garcia reached grasping hand into his overnight bag, pulled out a baggie of 5 or 6 melatonin and a nip of whiskey, and sank into a deep, dreamless, drug-induced sleep. He awoke to saffron rays glittering the oversized window above a now damp and pungent-smelling bedspread. Father Garcia's concoction had been much more successful than he had hoped, and it was now nearing 6 the next evening. Slowly coming to, he perceived a slight creak, and, looking up, noticed Father Harris peeking in, checking up on his friend, and doing a bad job pretending not to notice the wetness of the sheets or the odor in the air. "Robbie, anything you need, anything you want to talk about, I'm here. I'm heading to the Starbucks on the corner now. Let me know what you want, and when you're ready to talk, meet me in my office, 4 doors down on the left." Shame at his present situation decorated his face, but his strong will forced him to look up at Luke and provide him a dignified response. "Thanks, I'm just going to take a shower and then I'll be there. How about a large caramel cold brew?" "Coming right up," Father Harris announced with a twinkling smile as he turned to leave. Exiting the shower, Father Garcia felt refreshed. He combed his hair and walked back into the bedroom, putting on a fresh black V-neck sweater and pair of dark jeans that complemented his complexion instead of his creased and stained clergy garb. He removed the soiled bedding from the mattress, flipped the mattress, and replaced it with a fresh pair left outside the room by Father Harris. He knew what time it was, but he was safe. Father Harris was waiting for him in his office with a large coffee, and he was far away from the church in Upper Manhattan that had become his own personal hellscape. He walked 30 feet down the hallway with a renewed, refreshed gait he hadn't felt for almost 48 hours. He walked up to Father Harris's office, noticing that the door was slightly ajar. When he peeked in, he saw his friend-turned-savior sitting at his oversized mahogany desk, just like the one he himself had back in the Heights, waiting patiently with a smile for Roberto to walk in, a coffee sitting patiently in front of the untucked chair across from the compassionate priest. Come in, please. A large caramel cold brew, and for good measure, a milk chocolate Hershey's bar. You used to love those back when we were in seminary. And I still do now. That's too nice of you, Luke. I really appreciate everything you're doing for me." Roberto took his place in the seat across from Luke, picked up the large, cold, clear Starbucks plastic in front of him, and took a long, much-needed sip. Maybe, he thought, a hot shower and some cold coffee is all I really needed to get out of this funk. But right after that comforting thought made its appearance, something on the desk to the right of Father Harris caught his eye. A clock, an ornate, antique table clock. Its four stout, finely crafted legs shined with overlaid silver, holding up a black base with etched, decadent lines painted gold. Topping that was a maroon and off-white marble pattern functioning as a second base set in slightly from the obsidian below it, and upon that lay four ostentatious pillars of pure bleached white on a dark aubergine backdrop, surrounding the clock face upon which Father Garcia's eyes were locked. Jet-black Roman numerals numbered the clock face, impressed upon it in the most fanciful Gilded Age style. One thin golden ring encircled the numerals from the inside and another from the outside. The two clock hands were longer and shorter pieces of elaborate Baroque metalwork in polished sterling silver, and together they formed a perfect vertical line, the minute hand standing erect towards the 12th, and the hour hand plunged downwards toward the 6. 6 menacing tolls rang out from the steeple above the church. It was 6 o'clock. Roberto's expression morphed into a grimace. A hot shower and cold coffee was not apparently enough to get him out of this funk. Robbie, are you there? Can you hear me?" Hypnotized by the clock and church bells, Father Garcia awoke from his daze to a concerned Robbie asking for his attention in a raised voice, waving his hands inches from Father Garcia's nose. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there." Father Garcia trailed off, ashamed of his performance. "Robbie, I'm really concerned, and I think you do know what is going on. At least I think there is a lot which you haven't told me yet. I'm here to help, and I'll never judge you. Please, for your sake, tell me what you think is happening." What you think is happening. Those words echoed in Father Garcia's head, as if whatever was happening was completely made up, as if he was crazy, as if it was only what he thinks is happening. No, he screamed in his head, something is happening here. I don't know what it is, I don't have the faintest clue. But I'm not crazy. He wasn't just scared anymore, he was angry. He tensed up. He wanted to yell at Father Harris, at his old friend Luke, but he was too frozen, and he was too afraid of losing the only help he had in bringing this damned thing to an end. And Luke was just too sweet, too kind to yell at. I just need a minute. Father Garcia stood up and headed towards the door. His hand touched the cold round brass knob, and he turned and pushed. As he did, the half-inch crack underneath the door revealed a white paper corner. He fainted, collapsing on the ground with a look of terror imposed on his face. Father Garcia opened his eyes to find a circle of black canonical robes encircling him in suffocating proximity. He felt a cool, damp washcloth being pressed against his head. He looked up to find Father Harris doing the pressing. Seeing that he was awake, he leaned in close and said, "Robbie, you're going to be okay, but you have to tell me everything. I put the letter in my pocket before I called the other priests to help. I'll make sure whatever is happening stays private between you and me, but you have to be candid." Roberto looked into Father Harris's deep, ocean-green eyes and gave him a slight yet serious nod, and Father Harris returned a slight yet reassuring smile. It wasn't until almost 8 that Roberto and Luke were alone again. One of the other priests was an EMT, and he insisted on staying around for a while to make sure Father Garcia was stable. The three shared small talk for a while, mostly church politics, while the two friends anxiously wanted the third to leave so they could start to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. Both were too pleasant to say anything too direct, and their subtle hints evaded understanding. Finally, eventually, the EMT priest was satisfied, and he left the two to their mystery. Father Harris pulled the envelope out of his inside jacket pocket. This time the front was not adorned with the ornate black penmanship which Roberto had become used to fearing. Rather, the usual message on the front was scrawled in a hasty, deep scarlet. "To Father Garcia, my sins." As Father Harris flipped over the envelope in his hands, examining both sides with the same care he showed Roberto noticed a message on the other side as well. Formed with the same ominous ink, it read, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Harris raised the letter to his nose, and when a decisive frown appeared upon his usual cheerful countenance, Roberto understood the implication. Father Harris placed the letter into Roberto's shaking hands. He too raised it upward toward and took a deep, awful whiff. The coppery scent of blood danced dreadfully across his nostrils. "I didn't want to open it without you," Father Harris directed to Roberto, "but I understand if you want me to open it. Hell, I think I'm nearly as creeped out as you are." Creeped out. Father Garcia wasn't just creeped out. He was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. No, he thought, I'm in the middle of a nervous breakdown. Looking down at the envelope he had just shakily placed down on the desk in front of him, something sent an extra cold chill up and down his already frozen spine. The yellow beam of Father Harris's 1920s porcelain desk lamp illuminated the outline of a small rectangle of lined paper, the kind of paper that must have gotten ripped out haphazardly from one of those miniature dollar store notepads. Father Garcia's apprehension and his perturbed mien served as a quay for Father Harris to walk toward the desk and pick the envelope up again. Anxiously yet gracefully sliding his thumb under the seal of the envelope, he separated the two pieces without even the slightest tear. He pulled out the sole contents of the envelope. The ratty piece of paper stood in contrast to the fine, fanciful penmanship beautifying its surface. Unlike the scrawled contents on the outside of the envelope, the words appeared here in black ink, the letters fashioned as if they had come from the tip of a quill. Lines and stanzas traveled from the top of the page to the bottom, morphing the words on the paper into a poetic address. For moments of deafening silence, Father Harris stood to the back of Father Garcia's chair still, his eyes scanning and rescanning the verse in front of him. He then walked forward, disrupting the sitting priest's quiet train of crashing thoughts, and placed the lined paper on the desk in front of Father Garcia. Attempting a compassionate gesture, Father Harris placed a large hand on his friend's bony shoulder, but all Father Garcia felt was an icy palm. "I think you ought to read this yourself," Father Harris uttered solemnly. "A dance amidst the tombstones, a waltz amongst the graves. Just as Christ carrying the cross, numbered are your days. The sun sets upon the earth, to rise upon the souls in hell. Shortly we shall gather in the nave, to hear a final knell, but only few will remember, and fewer will forget. O Father, bless me, for I have sinned, but blessed I have not been yet." Flipping the paper over to see whether the poem spilled onto the other side, Father Garcia was greeted by a single number. A protracted breath of defeat slowly departed the priest's lips. Deflated, leaning over the table, a clenched expression over his face, a single tear left his strongly shut eyes creeping mournfully down his cheek. Luke Harris gave him a few minutes of silence.